So last time I was in this seat, we began our consideration of nyoho shelter, because of course our theme for this year is tangible thusness. We've looked at nyoho food, nyoho clothing, and now we're on the third face, nyoho shelter. So last time I talked in a fairly abstract way about the reality that whatever temple we're in is the only temple, or whatever house we're in is the only house, or whatever dentist office we're in, right, is the only dentist office. This time I'm going to be more concrete, right? Let's bring this thing sort of back down to earth. So we need to talk about, amongst other things, the Shichido Garan. So Shichido Garan is the template, if you will, for laying out a Buddhist temple compound. So for the Japanese language students among us, right, Shichi is 7, Do is hall, Garan is a temple. Shichido Garan, 7-hall temple, right? So in some famous cases, there really are 7 temples in 7 buildings in a compound that are laid out exactly following this template. In others, it's simply a large temple with various outbuildings. If there really are 7 halls, exactly what those 7 halls are can vary. But it's helpful just to know there is sort of a template, a standard. So Garan is an interesting term. It is not the everyday term for a temple. Maybe you've never even heard this word. Temple is usually ji. Eihei-ji, Soji-ji are 2 head temples. Sometimes you will hear this place referred to as Sanshin-ji. So that's a fairly typical term. There are other related terms that are good to know. Dera is another one, right? Kiyomizu Dera is also a temple. Kiyomizu Dera is in Kyoto, is a famous temple. An is a hermitage. So when I was running the Milwaukee Zen Center, their Japanese name is Kokyo-an, right? Lake Mirror Hermitage. They're right by the lake, the Great Lakes, right? Lake Mirror Hermitage. So an is another term you'll hear. So Garan is not a normal word like these. You will not find that appended, right, to somebody's temple name. It comes from a longer term, Sogyo-ranma, which is a transliteration of the Sanskrit, Samgarama, a garden for monks. Right? We can think of our temple and our temple complex as a garden for monks. So originally a garan was a park where the teachers and the students gathered together, maybe to talk about the Dharma, to have some practice, right? Eventually this thing comes to mean a temple or a temple complex. So Shichido Garan as a term doesn't appear in the literature until the Edo period, right? Which begins in the 1600s. So this is not, relatively for us, an ancient term. This was not around really in Dogen's day. We don't know what those early park gatherings were like. We don't know how that transition kind of happened from people gathering in a park to suddenly there's a temple. So there's a bit of mystery around that. So as I mentioned, what exactly gets included in a Shichido Garan varies a lot by sect, by circumstance, by location, right? We'll talk about the standards list of standard 7, but just know if you're looking at a complex, it may or may not have all of those things. In the early days, for instance, all the compounds had a pagoda as the centerpiece. Usually there was some relics or something in there, right? Those largely fell out of favor by the time Zen arrives in Japan. Other buildings become more important, so you don't see a pagoda in a Soto Zen sort of temple compound the way you might have in China, or in some other places or other times. So you all have a handout. Those at home, you can download it and look at it. Virtual folks, as I say, it's posted under the virtual practice button. If you're watching this recording at some later time, there's maybe a link. Maybe we'll put a link in the description to where this will be on Sanshin Source within our Nyoho Shelter section, so you can follow along. Okay, so by the 15th century, in the Zen tradition, typical 7 buildings are the Sanmon, or the main gate, the Butsuden, or Butsudo, which is the Dharma hall, the main hall. Hatto is the lecture hall. Kuin, which has other names, but Kuin is the kitchen and the office, kind of combined. The Sodo is the building dedicated to Zazen. The Tosu is the toilet, and the Yokushitsu is the bath. So those 7 are the sort of standard 7. So I want to take a minute and talk about what each of these things is, so we have some idea, right? Sanmon is the main gate, literally 3 gates. San is 3, right? Literally 3 gates. So these entrances represent the 3 gates of liberation, which would be emptiness, or kumon, formlessness, musomon, and inaction, muganmon. Emptiness, formlessness, inaction, right? The 3 gates of liberation. So when we go through the gate, we are being freed from the 3 poisons in a symbolic way. So that gate is not sort of a barrier to keep people out or, keep out the animals or something, right? That gate there is a practice, right? We go through that gate, we are liberated from the 3 poisons. So those gates aren't sort of little fences with little openings. We think of a gate like a garden gate, right? These are not like that. These can be 2-story structures. These things are huge, with often Buddhist statues in the upper part providing some kind of protection for the people who are coming in and out. The more important the temple complex, the bigger the Sanmon is. When I was at Toshoji, we were just renovating the Sanmon, right? So we'd pull the figures out of there, and it was all kind of, for a while, it was a little bit under reconstruction. It's an important, clearly, it's the first thing you encounter, right, when you come to the temple complex. So interestingly, when I was at Toshoji, I used to climb up into the top of the Sanmon, into the top of the gate, because there's an actual little room kind of up there with some little windows that open. I used to climb up into the top of there to practice baika, right, to practice hymn singing. So I wouldn't disturb everybody, because in a temple complex, like, you hear everything, right? So I used to climb up there and face over the parking lot. So I had the temple at my back, and I'd face over the parking lot. And I'd sing baika, do my baika practice kind of over the parking lot. One day I was singing something, and I got to the end of it, and I heard a little voice down here, and I kind of peeked out. Here was Seido Roshi. Oh, very nice. Oh, dear. Right? So Sanmon is not typically where you go to practice baika, but that was my little sort of refuge. Okay, Butsudo, Buddha Hall, is where sort of the official ceremonies happen. So traditionally, if you're chanting for the emperor, you're chanting for the nation, you're doing something really kind of in an official way, that will happen in the Butsudo. The Hatto, or the Dharma Hall, is where the chanting services happen. It's where the lectures, Dharma talks happen. So if you're doing memorial, you're doing morning service, right, liturgy, that all happens there. The Sodo, or the Sangha Hall, is what we in North America would typically call a Zendo, right? We don't have a Sangha living in this room. So Sodo, Sangha Hall. As we'll see, in the Sodo, traditionally, you sit zazen there, you sleep there, you eat your meals there, you pretty much live on your tatami. And in North America, we don't have that circumstance, right? We're householding, mainly. So typically, we call this room a Zendo, place we do Zen. So we'll come back to the Sodo shortly, because that's the building we know the most. Right? That's the thing we're most familiar with. So the rest of these buildings are pretty self-explanatory: the kitchen, the toilet, and the bath. These are utilitarian functions, but they are most definitely places of practice. There are altars in all these places. These things are all opportunities, right, to keep zazen in mind, to pay attention to what we're doing. We've been talking about nyoho food this year, so we already know like how and why the kitchen is an important place of practice. Everything associated with that, right, is about practicing the Dharma. So we've seen that in a very real way. We may not be used to thinking about practice in the toilet or practice in the bath. We kind of think, well, those are necessary, sort of necessary evils, right? Those are very much places of practice. So in fact, the toilet and the bath are 2 of the 3 silent practice places. The Zendo, the toilet, and the bath are the 3 places that we keep silent. So we have the opportunity to be really intentional about being in those shared spaces. And wouldn't that be an interesting way to approach our toilet and bath practice, right? It's pretty easy, really. If you're in a sort of a shared bath space or a shared toilet space, it's pretty easy to start a lot of idle chatter, right? I mean, imagine you go into the restroom at work or at school, what starts to happen? Did you hear what so-and-so said? Right? You're sitting in the bath and, you can start a lot of idle chatter. So these are really informal spaces as compared to a Hatto or a Butsudo or a Zendo, right? It's easy to sort of drop your zazen mind. So there's a real opportunity in these places to think carefully about practice. There are things we do in these spaces to remind ourselves to pay attention. And that these things are practiced. Both the toilet and the bath have their own altars. Those altars are on the route, the doshi's route in the morning, visiting all the altars and ending up right in the Sodo or in the Zendo. Those things are on the route. So Ususama Myoho is the god of the toilet. There is such a thing, right? He has an altar above the door, so the toilet altar is typically above the door. You go under it when you go into the toilet. You stop and bow, and you go under it when you go into the toilet. So when we go use the toilet, we bow partly because in sort of olden times, this was a dark and scary place, right? These were not bright, white, shiny, sanitary, well-lit places. These could be dark and scary places. There was some danger of falling in and drowning. And I mean, what an impure death, right? Like, nobody wants that. So you were kind of looking for protection. Ususama Myoho, please keep me out of the cesspit, right? Yikes. But we can also say, simply taking a moment to bow and remind ourselves, even going to the toilet is practice. Yes, there's purification and all that stuff, but right, even in that moment, what are we doing with body and mind? So I think the other really interesting association for Ususama Myoho is with fertility. And you would think, how does that happen? Well, that's because the waste products were collected and guess what? Used as fertilizer. So nothing gets wasted, right? Not only was there a better degree of sanitation than simply having a big cesspit, but interconnectedness is right there, right? Nothing is wasted. Everything is functioning together. So we grow the rice, we eat the rice, something happens to the rice, goes back on the field, we grow more food. So it's really an interesting reminder, isn't it, of total dynamic functioning. Even something as simple as going in and using the toilet. So we respect Ususama Myoho as the protector of that space. We keep that toilet area clean and pleasant. We pay attention to what we're doing. Hopefully he takes care of us in our practice, right? So there is also a practice for entering the bath. We used to arrive in full robes, just like this, right, into that bath space. There is a little area with an altar. You do a full little chanting service with bows when you go in and when you go out. So you do your little service, you go do your bath, you come back out, you bow again going out. Of course, there's a purification element to bathing. It's not just cleaning the body, it's also purifying the mind. So again, we have an opportunity to remind ourselves, what are we doing in this space? This is not a sort of throwaway activity or a throwaway space. There is no part of this temple complex that doesn't have some practice element, right? So the figure enshrined there in the bath is Bhattabhata Bosatsu. Bhattabhata Bosatsu is one of the eight great bodhisattvas who pledged to protect the Dharma in the age of Mappo. We've talked about the age of Mappo here, right? The decline of the Dharma. So this bodhisattva has said, I will pledge to protect the Dharma in this sort of declining state. So this bodhisattva, according to the story, attained enlightenment by contemplating water. That was his practice. So of course his awakening comes about in the bath. So we have his presence here in the Yokshitsu in the bath, right? It is possible to attain awakening even in the bath. So we need to not forget moment by moment practice. So sometimes we see him as a statue. Sometimes it's a famous painting. Maybe you've seen the famous painting of the arhats in the bath. He's attaining his awakening at that point. So anyway, we can see all of these buildings and spaces in your handout. It's in the aerial photo of Zuiryuji, which is this one, right? We can see all the spaces in this aerial photo. This is a place in Kyoto, as I say. This is the Soto Zen Temple complex, constructed in the Edo period. So it fits, right? This is considered to be sort of the classic example of this kind of layout. So the Sanmon, the Butsuden, and the Hatto in this place are designated national treasures. That's how important these buildings are in terms of the culture and the context and the history. So we can also see the corridor that goes around the outside from the Sanmon, right, all the way around to the Hatto, makes an enclosure around the Butsuden. So we can see how this is very much a sort of a delineated sacred space. This is a delineated space of practice. Butsuden is where the principal image is. Principal image is enshrined, in this case, Shakyamuni Buddha. So right in the middle, right in the Butsuden. So the Sodo or the Zendo on the left, or the southern side, Oguri or Kuin or kitchen on the right, or the northern side. So we have this symmetrical kind of arrangement, right? This orientation on a north, south, east, west axis is standard for Shichido Garan. It's not just a building complex plunked down somewhere that looks pretty. Somebody actually figured out, right? Where's the axis? Of course, there's lots of reasons for energy and where the sun goes and all of that, right? But it's very much a part of its environment. This is not just, well, let's clear cut something and stick a temple complex there. So these are also the buildings that Eiheiji has, and in fact that complex is based on Tentong Temple in China, where Dogen trained, because of course we know the monastic, I don't like the word, but monastic compound, the monastic container, was one of the two things Dogen brought back from China. He said, this is how the authentic Dharma is going to get transmitted. This is how we're going to preserve the teachings and transmit the teachings. We need this particular container. So this is really important for Dogen, right? He brings back this, not only the structures of the buildings, but how we practice in the buildings, right? We have very specific instructions about that. So on the other side of Zuiryuji, boy, that's hard to say, isn't it, right? We have Koshoji, that's this complex here. That's your other picture. This is the oldest Zen temple in Japan, founded originally by Dogen in 1233. It was rebuilt in 1645, so these are not the specific buildings Dogen was in. This has many more than 7 buildings, and I realize that because these are color photos printed in black and white, they're a little hard to see, but you can see the pattern, right? We have the north, south, east, west pattern. We have the same buildings in roughly the same places. The orientations to each other, right, are the same. Some of you have heard me say, maybe as part of nyoho food, that our oryoki set represents the body of Buddha, right? So that largest bowl is his head, and the other 4 bowls are the body, and the chopsticks and the spoon are the arms and legs. And when we lay this out, we have a particular sort of template, and here's the body of Buddha. So the way we carry these bowls, the way we handle them, right, the way we treat them is very much, these are relics of Buddha. This is the body of Buddha. We see the same pattern in the temple complex layout, right? The Butsudo is the heart, right? This is where the figure of Shakyamuni is. It's right in the middle. The Butsudo is the heart of this thing. The Hatto is the head. Why? Because usually this is where Dharma talks are happening. I think. This is my speculation, right? We're doing chanting services. We're doing Dharma talks. That's the head. The other buildings are the arms and legs. So the temple also represents the body of Buddha. I think that's one layer of meaning for this, right? I don't see that talked about a lot. I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure I didn't make it up, but I can really see the parallel, right, with the oryoki and the temple complex. There's a head, there's a body, there's an arm, there's arms and legs, right? We're really functioning within the body of Buddha, right? Buddhakaya, right here. But we can also situate the temple in the larger sort of landscape of sacred space as a mandala. We can really sort of put a mandala over this and go, okay, this starts to make sense, right? Mandala is a kind of a spiritual map of the universe. It has a central axis. So the main halls here are aligned along that axis, right? The most important ones are in the center. The more informal practice places toward the outside. So here's Buddha in his cosmic center. He's surrounded by these important Dharma functions. And the outer buildings, right, the utilitarian buildings move outward from the core. So as you move back and forth from the ordinary world, sort of daily functioning, bath, office, kitchen, toilet, right, toward the center of this thing, the middle of this thing, the more sacred space, if you will, in the inner halls, we can see this movement in and out, right? So the closer you are to the center of the mandala, the more sacred the space. So the closer you are to the center of this, the closer you are to Buddha, if you want to think about it that way, right? This layout is designed to move you toward the center. Look where all the corridors go. Look where all the pathways go, right? It's designed to encourage you and move you toward the center, to be with Buddha. So this is also a representation of Buddhist cosmology, with Mount Sumeru at the center. So you may have heard of Mount Sumeru, or know something about that. It's a mythological mountain in the center of the universe. And this is not only Buddhism, this is also Hinduism and some other Eastern traditions, right? So this is where the gods live. Gods live on Mount Sumeru. Everything's arranged around that. So it's the same kind of idea, right? The most sacred thing is in the center. Because it's not a mountain in the physical world, Mount Sumeru, the size and the height and the volume and the weight and all of those things are not measurable because this doesn't exist, right, in the physical world. Some scriptures say it's tens of thousands of miles high, extending above and below the surface of the sea. So you can imagine the extent of this thing. So as we enter a temple complex, we go through the Sanmon, that three-gate sort of entryway. We're purified of the three poisons. We arrive inside a wall or a corridor that serves as a boundary, right? Again, we can see there's a wall here. There's a hallway, there's a corridor. So we get through that sort of space into this enclosed kind of delineated sacred area. We know we're now inside this thing with a particular purpose, and that purpose may be different than what's going on in the world outside. Not better or worse, but different, right? There's something, our minds turn towards something, right? We drop preoccupation. Okay, now I know what I'm here to do. I'm here to practice, right? I'm here inside, sort of Buddha's world. So we move through the courtyards. You can see there's lots of gravel courtyards, both in this photo and in the previous one. We can really see there's very intentionally curated. Boy, we did a lot of weeding in the gravel, right? That's a place of practice right there. So those courtyards are sort of transitional spaces, right? They're empty, really, of anything other than gravel. So we get to drop preoccupation. We get to drop distraction. We move through those spaces, right? It's very clear, like what we're moving toward and what we're doing. Then we get to the main buildings. We see those main buildings are more elaborate, paying homage in a certain way, I suppose, to what we're doing and what they represent. They house the significant figures, the temple treasures, the Dharma activities or the more formal activities, right? So as we move to the center, we're moving away from taking a bath or cooking a meal, and we're moving toward sitting zazen, doing liturgy, right? Doing something more formal. So we would typically associate mandalas, I think, with the more esoteric schools rather than Zen, right? We don't talk a lot about mandalas here. We see them in Tibetan practice or Shingon practice or other places, right? But Zen has this significant Shingon streak. It's really syncretic. If we think that Zen is one thing that's been sort of come down through time with no changes, well, no. There is an authentic Dharma being transmitted, but the way that manifests is very much influenced by its context. So we have this really kind of strong Shingon streak. Keizan Jokin was particularly interested in this sort of esoteric practice. A lot of our liturgy is affected by how he thought about that. So you won't find mandalas hung on the wall in the Zendo. We don't do visualization practices, for instance, with mandalas. That doesn't mean they haven't influenced our practice, and here's one way. Right? So it's useful to know a little bit something about that. So laying out a temple complex as a mandala gives that space, that place, a certain kind of spiritual power. We're aligned on axes, we're in conversation with the land that we're on, we're doing some powerful spiritual practices. All of that's happening within a certain universal spiritual map. So imagine all these things kind of coming together, right? This is not random. Nothing about this is random. It makes all of those activities more effective, right? We don't get to see this so much in North America because, in a really nyoho way, we tend to make practice buildings out of whatever we have, right? We're practicing in old houses, we're practicing in garages, we're practicing in garden sheds, in storefronts, in schoolrooms. And great, that's how we bring practice to this country, but we lose this piece, right? So it's really useful and interesting, I think, to know this context. When we look at our kitchen altar, for instance, we're about to talk about the relationships of these buildings to each other. We have a tiny, tiny kitchen. Traditionally, that altar would face the other way, right? It would face toward the Soto. We can't do it, but we have an altar, and we practice with the altar. So we have to, in our nyoho way, right, make use of what's here. Okay, let's take a look at the building that we're probably the most familiar with, and that is the Soto or Zendo. You have a diagram on your handout, which comes from a wonderful little book from Zuioji. So this is a typical Soto, a typical Zendo. And you can see what all the things are, and if you have questions about those things, we can talk about it. Okay, so Koen Franz trained here, Zuiko Redding trained here, Todo-san spent some time here. This is an important, Zuioji is an important training temple in our school. So if you talk to people about Zuioji, that's an important place. So the abbot there, Narasaki Tsugen Roshi, was big into nyoho. Some of the things I know about nyoho, I know from Zuiko, and she learned from him. So there's a kind of a direct connection there. And of course, Yoga started with Zuiko as well. This is where we start bringing things back now to our theme of tangible lessons. How does nyoho intersect with all of this stuff? So, Tsugen Roshi points out that Zuioji's Sodo can hold 40 people. Well, we can't quite hold 40 here. We can get 28 at a stretch. They can hold 40 people. He says, if 40 people each had some individual house or hermitage or space or shack or building or something, that would take a lot of space and a lot of resources. But 40 practitioners living together in a Sodo is a much lower impact situation, right? The footprint is very much smaller. It's compact, it's simple, and still it allows for meaningful practice. People are still eating and sleeping, right, and doing zazen and doing all the life functions and the things they need to do in a much more compact and manageable space. So imagine 40 people in 40 houses, and then imagine a Sodo, which is an interesting sort of perspective. So turning to Tai Shikiryo, right, materials and color and size, the three aspects of things that are, we think about with nyoho. So Tsugen Roshi says to use available resources as materials, so bamboo, wood, stone, whatever you have, use those things to build your Sodo. He says this building shouldn't be fancy, but it should be adequate to shelter ourselves from the weather. So, if we have a hole in the roof, we should fix it. We don't have to be ascetic about it. So not fancy, but adequate, right? Big enough, sturdy enough, strong enough. He goes on to quote Eko Hashimoto Roshi. You may remember Eko Hashimoto Roshi as the other main mover and shaker in the 20th century Nyoho movement with Sawaki Roshi. So these two folks worked together. Were both very important. So Eko Roshi makes these comments at the opening of a new Zendo. He says, we should be free from love or hatred because the main point is the substantiality of the materials rather than the external appearance of the building. We should not worry if any part of the boards is ugly, for we can use them where they cannot be seen. We should strictly observe ourselves so as to emancipate ourselves from certain ideas. Using more materials and resources than are necessary is the same as throwing them away. On the other hand, being too conservative is only the negative emotion of greed. Neither of these is good. When we practice avoiding these, we walk the way of the Buddha smoothly like a cloud, right? So I think he brings up this interesting point. If we're being too conservative, that's greed. And if we're using too much, that's also greed. So like, what's our mind doing when we're building our spaces and populating our spaces and taking care of our spaces? So as for the color of the Sodo, of course, it should be a broken color in the way that our robes should be a broken color or a blended color. Tsugen Roshi points out it's not just the walls, it's also the things in the room, the things we need, right? The cushions and curtains and altar cloths and oryoki bowls and whatever we're using, right? Also, we need to think about this broken color so we don't form this attachment to a really clear, strong primary color. Interestingly, I think he also reminds us to pay attention to light in the building. So when we think about color, there's also a thing in there about tone, atmosphere. What's the feeling in the room? So he says, you also need to think about light, because the wrong amount, he says, can lead to distraction or depression. And I immediately think of Uchiyama Roshi's ZZ line, thinking, sleeping, distraction, depression, distraction, depression. So we know today, there are those who are really affected seasonally by the shifting in the light. But really interesting to think about, how is the light in this space? In the morning when we come in and it's dark outside, this room is dark because we are not disconnected from what's happening outside. In the middle of the afternoon, this room is bright because there's a beam of light that comes through this window. It's lovely. It comes right down the wall, right? It's really cool. So we can feel the shifting of that light. But we need to be in a place which is not a cave all the time, and we need to be in a place which is not knocked down bright all the time. What is happening outside this room? How are we connected with that? So interesting to think about that. At one point, when we were first starting with the virtual and the television and the recording, one of our tech people said, well, now we should replace all the light bulbs in the Zendo with something more blue because it'll work better for television. I went, what? Are we not constantly being reminded not to take our screens to bed because of blue light? What's that going to do to our zazen, right? So it's like we get to think about all that stuff. We didn't change them, right? It's warm color in here. So when Hoshin painted these walls, this lovely light sage green, imagine what they would look like under blue light. Yikes, right? So light is important as, as part of this whole color, tone, feeling piece. So finally, size or amount. You can see on the handout that this soto is divided into two spaces, right? The lower one is the gaido and the upper one is the nido. So the gaido, gai means outside. So this is the sort of outside space. The main one, the nido, is where you sit if you are actually enrolled in the training temple, doing your training and credentialing. So the gaido is where you sit if you have to, say, get up in the middle of the period because you have a job. In the morning, maybe you're the one who has to go and climb up into the bell tower and ring the bell 54 times, which happens during the last period of zazen in the morning, right? You're coming and going. Or maybe you have to leave because you're cooking the meal or you're doing something else. So rather than coming and going from the main space, you come and go from this outside, this gaido space. Or if you arrive late, right, and you see that the curtain is down and the doshi's already in, then you can't go in. You sit your period out there. As I mentioned, nido is where you sit, eat, sleep, right? Kind of live your life if you're formally there for training. This has 4 sections. You can see these 4 sections of seats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats in each of these 4 sections. So guess what? The size of the elements of the soto is based on the average chu size. This seems familiar if you've ever sewn an okesa. Right, here we are again. So of course, everyone's tatami is not a different size based on this. There's a standard. But interesting, right? So our robes are based on this, and also our sitting space, the size, and how we build the building is actually based on this, which I didn't know until I read Tsugen Roshi's book. I thought that was a really kind of interesting insight. So individual space is 2 chu by 4 chu. Standard tatami, right? Each section then has 5 of these units in this diagram, so we can see. So that's 20 people. You'll notice he said we could seat 40. You can actually put 2 people on each space if you have to do that. So the rectangles marked N, you can see those little rectangles marked N. Those are the kanki, those are the storage spaces. So there's the top shelf, and there's a curtain area on the bottom. And the okesa goes on top of the kanki, and the personal items go in this little shelf area. Maybe that's your sutra book or your various collections of things. The bedding goes behind the curtain. That is what you get. There's no storage unit for you. There's no outbuilding for you. That, if you're in a traditional setting, that is what you have. Right? So when Tsugen Roshi says we're living in a very compact, simple, non-attached way, there you go. So you see the thin strip there marked with an O on the other side of the kanki, right? There's this thin strip marked with an O. Those are the boards at the edge of the space where you lay out your oryoki and you eat your meals. And those are considered kind of pure spaces. We don't sit on those. We don't put our feet on those because the meal is practice, right? Meal is pure food. So when you're sleeping, your pillow goes there so your head faces Buddha, or in this case, Manjushri. You never put your feet right toward the altar. So that's what's going on there. The width of the meal board is determined by the width of the placemat in the oryoki set. So again, everything is interconnected, right? Somebody measured that placemat and said that's how wide that board needs to be. So it's not a random size. It's not whatever we think looks good, right? So in front of the individual tatami, then, you can see kind of where the O is. There's a certain amount of space between these meal boards. And it feels kind of like a hallway. It's just enough that you can get up and down into your seat, that you can do bows, full bows, get ready for kinhin without getting in the way of other people. One of the important measures about this, I think, is that after the morning service, we go back, in the hatto, we go back to the soto to do another short service for our individual ancestors, and we all just stand with our backs, we're standing in front of our places with our backs to our places. And there are times where we are doing 3 bows, and this has to be wide enough that 2 people can bow, right? So again, it's very directly tied to what the function of our practice. How do we need to practice in this space? This is not a random width. And it's not like, well, if we're a grander temple, this is going to get bigger, right? It's tied to human practice. So in that way, I think that's really, really kind of interesting. Okay, So Tsugen Roshi makes the point, living together in this way, as we've seen, forces us to simplify, forces us to use fewer resources, forces us to pay attention to what's our footprint, sort of literally and figuratively, right? What's our footprint in these practice spaces? It also naturally results in cooperation, because you can't live 40 people in the Zendo or even 20 people in the Zendo without cooperating. And I think our feeling of that here might be when we sit Sesshin, and we live together in this room, right, from 4 a.m. to 9 p.m., 3 days, 5 days, 7 days at a time. There's a certain amount of cooperation that arises naturally. It has to be that way, right? We have to function together. We have to fold in. We have to pay attention to what everybody else is doing, or it doesn't work. So again, the space itself supports that practice of awakening. It reminds us about something. If I'm at home doing whatever, my cats don't care what I do. If I'm here and I'm stepping on people, that's a problem. So there's a real opportunity there. So in the middle of the Soto, and you can see it on the diagram, is Manjushri, just as we have up here, right, at Tanshin. In a traditional Soto, Manjushri is sitting in a chair rather than on a lion. The lion symbolizes wisdom, and the chair itself is the lion's seat. So it's not just Manjushri sitting in the lion's seat. It's all of us sitting in the lion's seat. So we don't need individually a special lion, right? The Zafu is the lion. The Zafu is the wisdom seat, because we're all bodhisattvas, right? Manjushri is representing all of us here in the Soto. So we don't have typically Shakyamuni here. We've got Manjushri representing wisdom, because that's what's happening in this space. So Tsugen Roshi wraps up by saying, in order not to cause even a trace of jealousy, contempt, covetousness, or desire for luxury, disciples of the Buddha need to take the utmost care regarding the design, material, color, and size of the Soto, so as to embody the formless Buddha's teaching as seen in the form of the Kesa. These three important fundamental rules of Buddha's teachings, the three nyoho, material, size, and color, apply to both the Soto and the Kesa. For a disciple of the Buddha, the three nyoho are also to be applied in every aspect of practice. The three nyoho symbolize our basic attitude toward life. When we live in these three nyoho, our practice brings us to supreme enlightenment. Therefore, if you practice at the Soto, even for a short time, or if you have any connection to a Soto at all, the seed of Buddha mind is planted and will grow. Excuse me. So again, practice space, not random. If we're even associated in any way with a Soto, you step into a Soto one time, the seed of Buddha is planted, right? And that seed will grow. So we have 3 more talks about Nyoho Shelter this year. Next week we're going to hear from Hoshin. And as we know, Hoshin sits in the intersection of being an artist and a professional builder and a Dharma teacher. So he has lots to draw on. So we'll hear a different perspective on Nyoho Shelter. And then 2 more from me this year. And that means, excuse me, that we are kind of in the home stretch now of Nyoho, our Nyoho year. And we're starting to look ahead to 2026. So in 2026, our theme is the world of Soto Zen. Why? We started in 2024 looking very specifically at lineage and legacy, right? Our three most immediate 20th century ancestors, Toto-san, Uchiyama Roshi, Sawaki Roshi. What were they doing? What were they teaching? What did they want us, particularly in this family, to be carrying? It was important that we really knew that, like pretty thoroughly. Because things we do here are a little bit different than you'll see in other places. Not better, just different. This year we've widened that scope a little bit. And we've looked quite particularly at tangible thusness, or Nyoho, because we inherit that quite directly from Sawaki Roshi, right? As one of the leaders of the 20th century Nyoho movement. Like, we really need to understand Nyoho to understand what he was doing with robes. So we had to widen that out. Next year we widen that out a little more. It's important that we understand what's coming from our family, but we have to be able to position ourselves diachronically and synchronically within the school. We have to understand, what is the Soto school about? To me, this is one more way to answer an important question, which is, why do we practice like this? Why does our practice look like this? Why have we centralized certain things, right? Why are we saying that certain things are themes, certain things are important? So we're going to widen out next year. There's so much interesting stuff to talk about historically, culturally, doctrinally, right? By the end of that year, I think we're going to have a really good sense of our place in not only the history, but in where things are today, where Soto Zen is today. Now, interestingly, this is happening at the same time that big changes are happening in North America as a whole. So you may know, my peers have made me the president of the board of Soto Zen North America, which is a parallel organization to the existing denomination. And we're going to work in tandem for the next 10 to 15 years. So what's actually happening is that Soto Zen NA is going to be the North American denomination. Soto Shu, headquartered in Tokyo, is going to start handing off some functions to Soto Zen North America so that it can sort of redeploy its resources in other places. So this is really forcing me and my peers to ask ourselves, what is Soto Zen in North America? What does that look like? How do we know that we are curating and transmitting authentic teachings? In order to know that, we have to know what authentic teachings are, right? So there's some super interesting questions happening at the national level. So my aspiration was to do this theme, this World of Soto Zen, long before I got heavily involved with Soto Zen NA, but somehow these things are coming together. So Sanshin has a real role to play in this thing, right? Sanshin has a real voice in this thing, because it's not only me, Doshin Johnson, who's also on our board, I've dragged her onto the board of Soto Zen North America. So Sanshin is really in the middle of this thing. So I think as a Sangha, we have a really interesting year, right? There's some really interesting intersections between what we're doing locally, which is important, but also what's happening sort of nationally in a way that we understand that we're part of a much bigger community. It can feel a bit like we're kind of isolated and insulated because we don't have a lot of Soto Zen temples like really close by, right? We see people virtually, people come to visit. But I think it's really important that we understand we're part of this much larger community, nationally and internationally. And in order to understand that, we kind of have to know what the story is, right? So it's a really interesting arc of the story, which we can dig into in a lot of ways. So I'm beginning to sort of throw that out there so we can see how what we're doing today and with tangible thusness and through the end of this year is going to flow quite naturally into the next larger scope, right? Which has a whole other interesting bunch of layers we can talk about. So, more than you wanted from me. Okay, what would you all like to say about nyoho shelter, Shichido Garan, use of space in this kind of very tangible way? We have, as I say, several more opportunities to back up and broaden again. And has anyone here besides Toto-san been in a Senlin Soto? I know folks at home, I know, Eido's out there and others, but anyone in the room actually been in these spaces? Okay, so you may have some questions. What would folks like to say? Let me start with people in the room, and then we'll go to folks at home. Questions here, or comments, or reflections? Please, Myogen.
There's something I don't understand. Well, there's a lot I don't understand. She's good. You made the comment of one robe, one bowl, one building. Mm-hmm. I don't understand how that fits into, or I don't understand how that fits.
So this idea that the temple we're in is the only temple?
Yeah.
And the dentist office we're in is the only dentist office?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there an intellectual way that I can explain that? So I think we can turn toward teachings about non-separation, because there is only here and there is only now, and you're very familiar with those teachings, right? And then I think if we're looking specifically, one of the points I made in that talk that I gave was when we walk into that space, into that temple space, we kind of know what we're there to do. And we're doing the same thing that everyone else around the country, around the world is doing in their temple space. There's this shared practice, right? So when we step into Zazen, it's the same, everyone's Zazen is the same Zazen, and it's the same Zazen as Shakyamuni Zazen. So there's only one, if we want to think of a space in that way, there's only one space called Zazen, and we're all in it. And in a way, there's only one temple, and we're in it, right? There's only one glass, and this is it. Because the things are not separate. So I think an intellectual explanation is inadequate to that, and I hate to fall back on the old, let's just sit down. I wouldn't try to puzzle that out intellectually. But when I think about the feeling of that, walking into a temple saying this is the only temple, there is something in my body and mind that says, yes, that's true. When I go to somebody else's Zendo, or I go to a temple in Japan, or I go to Zen Shichido to do a conference and I'm up on the platform being an Ino, it's like that's the same space that I'm in whenever I'm in a practice place. And in the same way, it's like whenever I put on this robe, I'm in that same space. And it's not magic, this is not magic woo-woo stuff. There is something about the experience of that which says this is the same space, right? Like you go to a dentist's office, you know what you're there to do. Every dentist's office is the same dentist's office, right? So in that way, it's like every temple is the same temple. It's the only one there is, because there's no separation. So like when we think about the Vimalakirti Sutra, right? He's got hundreds and millions of bodhisattvas in his one little sick room. Somehow that space doesn't have a normal dimension, or Mount Sumatra, we can't measure it, doesn't have a normal dimension, right? There's something about that. So part of our consideration about nyoho space can be about what is space about. And because you're interested in time, you might think about it the same way that you think about time. What is time about, right? Time goes backwards and forwards in every direction, right? So space in a way does the same thing. And maybe this is something we want to talk about again before the end of the year, because I think you're raising something really interesting, right? So I'm not saying become an expert on quantum physics or all that stuff, but right? There is something about entering into a space that you go, yeah, this temple is the same temple. It's all one big temple. Just like your life is not separate from the lives of all other beings. I think it goes that direction. Is that enough to chew on for now? Yeah. It's not you're raising a question which is not simple, and the answer is not simple, and I don't want to give you a pat answer, because I don't think that's helpful. Yeah. Other things in this room? Say it.
Yeah, on the Koshoji photo, toward the upper left, it says Dogen Zenji Cemetery.
Cemetery.
That doesn't mean he's there.
I think there's probably ashes there. There is something at Eheji as well, and I have to say, I don't know, I have to look into it, but there's probably something there.
Also, a little bit to the right of the soda, it looks like a pagoda there, isn't it?
To the right of the
in the courtyard.
Sodo. Oh, yeah, looky, there's a tiny little pagoda in there. And I think that's probably a smaller stone one, as opposed to an actual 7-layer building, which would have been like in China, the big 7-layer building. Yeah, there's a little pagoda there. That is a nod to that history. You are absolutely right. So again, black and white, it's a little harder to see, but I think you're not wrong about that. Other things? Corey?
I have some thoughts about this Zendo being the only Zendo. Like, I'm thinking back to my experience working and so on and so forth, and like, doesn't matter what workplace I'm in, like when I get into that space, I know, like what you said, I know what I'm there to do. And even now when I go from location to location, like the particularities of each location on campus are different. There are different like routes that I need to go on, different like specific tasks I need to do. But generally, I go in and I'm like, all right, I'm here to work. There's this list of things that I need to do. Mm-hmm. The way that I need to act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to experience that. Yeah. I think there's the additional in a practice place. I think there's this additional layer about everyone being in the same zazen space, but I'm kind of still doing discernment about that, which is not separate from what you've said. Yeah. Other things in this room, Neil.
Yeah. No. So I think of it often around the frame of like householder practice, and so thinking the differences. And I liked what resonated with me was this idea of using too much is like throwing it away, and using too little is like greed. And as listening to a program about food waste and just the how it was framed sometimes as a ethical failure in that there's people who are going hungry, but framed now also as a climate failure, that it's a huge contributor. And so I think of, for me, like, you know, trying to explore, like, for householder practice, you know, what is using those resources in a wasteful way, and then what might be too conservative of an approach. And so, yeah, it's something I'd like to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah. So, of course, where we really encounter that quite directly is with food practice.
Yeah.
Right? Because all of our food is donated, either directly because someone donated food or because someone donated money and we went out and bought the food for the sesshin or whatever. So all of that is donated. We are not allowed to waste donations. Those are donations to Buddha, not to us. So we have to be really, really careful about that. And then food waste is an ethical failure, which is an interesting way to look at it, right? It's not just, oh, well, we had money, you know, and we feel better because we can compost it, and Sawyer takes it to the garden and we, you know, grow food on it. But still, right, that's one of those places that we experience that really directly. So we need to make enough food that people are healthy, otherwise it's greed. Or if we make too much, because we want everyone to love us, there has to be lots of food, it has to be very fancy, and we waste part of that, ethical failure, right? So it's a really interesting practice of being exactly where we need to be, right? So whether that's fabric for robes, it's food for meals, it's how big is our space, there are lots of dharma gates around that. And I certainly think for householder practice, in some ways it's almost more immediate, because here we're not necessarily always cooking 3 meals a day. We're at home, we're eating all the time. And I think we create a home practice space wherever we're doing our zazen, even if it doesn't stay up all the time, even if we have to get the cushion and put the cushion down. There's something about that space. We enter into that space. We are entering into the temple. Even though that, you know, in your case, it's an hour and something away from here. When you're entering into that space, you're entering into the temple. And it's all the same temple. It's all the same zazen space, right? Awakening is all the same awakening. So it's a really interesting way to feel, I think, connected. Especially, we've got people, you know, out of the country. And yet, somehow, and then, you know, T shows up in the morning from Canada, and somehow we're in the same temple, right? It's a really interesting way to consider our practice. Yeah. Other things in this room?
Well, one thing I'd also like to add is you also, in doing the home practice, you also need to be open to your practice and do what you can to get out of your comfort zone. The best example I can give you is I had a friend visiting one time from New York, and I basically said, oh, we're out of food. We need to go shopping. She goes, what? And she goes and looks in the food. Nope, plenty. We ate for 2 days. And I think about that. I mean, that was a good 13 years ago. But I think about that a lot, especially when it comes time to start cleaning up my refrigerator. Do I have bad stuff? What's good? What is there to eat? Or whatnot? And, you know, and so, yeah, there's a certain sense. You have to be open to the practice.
Yeah, so if we're practicing at home, we have just as many dharma gates, right? Sometimes more. And you know, practicing at home in some ways is a lot harder because we're managing ourselves. There isn't the container. There isn't a sangha around us. There isn't a fixed schedule. Nobody's ringing a bell, right? We have to make those practice decisions on our own, moment by moment by moment. So it's more challenging in a lot of ways. So I applaud the people who are steady home practitioners, right? It's not always so easy. Other things in this room? Rachel?
Slightly different topic, but
That's
you
okay.
mentioned how the architecture is all set up on the axis. I was curious, which is north, and why is that orientation chosen from the spiritual reasons, or maybe even all just the daily logistical practical reasons?
Yeah, so one of these, I think, well, it was somewhere in my notes that I described which side was north and south. As you see, I've given you the actual URLs for these photos, and if you'll look at those pages, it might help.
Okay.
The schematic for the notification of the schematics has north-south orientation.
Yes, the Soto has a north-south. So the room has a north-south, yeah, the temple complex is north. I actually didn't have time to dig into, but I'm going to, what exactly the north-south, east-west things about. I mean, I'm sure it's energy meridians and stuff, but I wanted, before I start just sort of speculating, I want to get good
Yeah, I'm
information.
just curious.
Because I'm interested in that as well, right? Again, not random, it's like none of this is random. So in North America, we don't have the luxury to situate things, we have to use the buildings we have, right? But I think it's useful to know what was the point of that. My guess is there are sort of abstract spiritual reasons, and there are probably also really practical reasons, like where is the sun, right? So we need to, I need to do some homework before I can answer your question.
Yin yang has the meaning of whether it's the sunny side or the north side.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking,
But when you talked about mandalas,
Yeah.
mandalas always have that
yes,
kind of medicine wheel orientation for each cardinal direction.
Yeah.
In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they have the Buddha families, the one in the
Mhm.
center, and then each of the directions, each one having a different association or meaning.
right,
The mandala itself is just a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional temple.
right. Yeah, so that's the stuff I want to dig into, because I think there's some interesting background there. So it's like I'm throwing it in front of you today, knowing I think we're not done with this conversation, because I think there's a lot of interesting, and of course, we're inheriting this across several cultures, across several countries, and so there's all these layers, interesting interconnected layers of meaning, which I'd like to dig into some more. So I think we have that chance. So I may come back to you for for pointers. Other things here? Folks at home, anything from you today? And Sawyer, you may have to help me on, I think I can see people. I see one hand up. Oh, Tees.
On the Ko-shoji handout, number 16, the inner sanctuary, it seems to be very much outer. What happens in the inner sanctuary?
I'm looking for it. 6, 15, 14.
The top right corner.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know what that is. And again, it might be if we go back to this, I don't think this page explained in tons of detail what those things were. So I have to say, I don't know. Interesting though, right? I hope we find out.
It also seems to be very outside for something that's
It does, so yeah, that's what makes me wonder, why is it called that, and like, what's its function? So we can see here, there's like the standard 7, but then there's lots of other things, which we may or may not immediately be able to identify. Some of these things often have to do with the real history of that place. Like there was some important event in the history of that temple, and so there's a structure that marks that, or there's a, if you go to Shogoji, there's a stupa. I mean, who's got a stupa, right? And yet that was a very particular thing in the life of that temple. So sometimes we really have to dig into the history of that particular complex to know what those things are about. Like not everybody has a Dogen Zenji cemetery, right? Not everybody has a stupa. I don't think everybody has an inner sanctuary. So, and not knowing what the original word is, it's hard to know. So this is great. I'm happy that people have questions I can't answer, because it means the conversation is not done. Yes. Other things from folks at home? Anything else from folks here? Please, Corey.
Can you, what's the the fish on?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
It's surreal.
That's interesting. So thank you, Myogen. It's a large version of this. So you might know a mokugyo is actually in the form of fish. Why fish? Fish have no eyelids. Their eyes never close, right? It's a wonderful image of constant awakening, right? So the one that's here, and I'm guessing you're looking at, is it in the Soto diagram, kind of outside? Yeah, this thing that looks like a fish. It actually looks like a fish. It's huge and wooden, and it's this, but it's extended. And it hangs from the ceiling. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's massive, right? So Yoga's got a picture. He's gonna hold it. So I mean, when you go to hit this thing, you have a mallet, which is it's amazingly long handle, and you're like this, right? It's one of the Narashimono, one of the things that makes noise. That's a signal for practice. I most closely associate it with meals. There's a roll down before meals that says, "Okay, now the people are gonna come in and clean the wooden board, and okay, now someone's gonna come in and bring an offering to Manjushri, and now the food's gonna be, right, there's a whole thing about it. So, I mean, if you can find pictures of them online, it's a big, massive mokugyo, right? So it's hollow, and you hit it with a mallet. It's just a big version of that. Okay, that's why it's a fish, because they don't have any eyelids. They never sleep. Fish never sleep, apparently. Any other questions here or away? All right. So if you get home and you look at these and you have more questions, write them down. I mean, let's have a conversation, because this is the interesting stuff. We know where this comes from, right? As I say, this conversation is not done. And if we've never actually seen these spaces or been in these spaces, this can feel like a whole lot of new information. So I encourage you, go online, look at a soto, look at a traditional soto, get a sense for that, right? If you go to Ryomonji in Iowa was built on shogoji plans. It is quite a traditional soto, so you get some sense of that. Why is it important? When we read, for instance, transcriptions of things that Dogen said, and he talks about the pillar, or he talks about the curtain, or something, right? If we don't have a sense of the space that he's in, we can really read things in there that aren't there. We can really read that from a North American sort of householding perspective if we don't know what he's really talking about. So to have some familiarity with Soto and Hato and some of these places is helpful for just our context and understanding teaching sometimes, right? In addition to just figuring out how we practice together. We're not making this up. People have been doing this for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and I assume they've learned something. So, other things today? All right, let's do our closing chant. Thanks, everybody.